I'm not going to be retelling Homer's Iliad. You already know that story. But there is something about the Iliad that I want to point out, and that's in chapter 2 of the Iliad. Sometimes it's called the Catalogue of Ships. And this is the list of people that went to war against Troy, where they came from, and how many ships that particular location sent. Now this turns out to be particularly accurate, something that many people say could only have come about if Homer were making reference to an actual existing Mycenaean document of some kind. In the catalog, Homer mentions 164 places that sent ships. Now 96 of those can be identified, and 3/4 of those that were identified do show Mycenaean occupation. In fact, in the early 1960s, there were some archaeologists, R. Hope Simpson and John Francis Lazenby, who surveyed the sites mentioned in the Homer's catalog, and they concluded, and this is a quote, "There is not a single place mentioned in the catalog which cannot be shown to have been inhabited in the Mycenaean period. Of those which have been excavated, none so far have failed to produce the evidence of Mycenaean occupation." Some of these Mycenaean sites were so thoroughly abandoned that the classical Greeks knew nothing about them. Furthermore, sites that in Mycenaean times were important, but in classical times weren't, those sent large numbers of ships, and the classical Greeks could never have guessed that relationship. Finally, names that you find in the Iliad can also be found in Mycenaean Linear B tablets, including Ajax, Achilles, Hector, and Orestes. One final comment now about the size of the force. In those days, the common ship that was used by the Greeks was the pentaconter, or 50er, so called because it had 50 people on board. And there were over 1,000 ships in the catalog. So if you just multiply 50 by 1,000, you get a Greek army of about 50,000. Now, seeing as though Achilles supplied his Myrmidons with a number of ships, 50 ships, you can guess the Myrmidons were at about 2,500. Now, where was Troy? Troy was in the northwest corner of what is now Turkey, or Anatolia, if you will. And this turns out to be a particularly good place to put a city. Troy was almost certainly placed where it was for three reasons. First of all, we know that there was a big wool industry there. Secondly, we know that horses were being raised there. But the most important reason may very well have to do with commerce. Troy is located very close to the Dardanelles. Now that's the transit between the Mediterranean Sea and the Black Sea. The Dardanelles used to be called the Hellespont. Now the Hellespont is a fairly narrow passage, and so is the Bosphorus. Those are the two choke points to get from the Mediterranean into the Black Sea. The Bosphorus is the site of Istanbul today, and the other site, that's where Troy was on the Dardanelles. These days, the Dardanelles is primarily a ferry crossing point between Europe and Asia. Mostly it's tourists going from Istanbul to Troy, I think. But all commercial shipping going from the Mediterranean to the Black Sea has to pass through here. Today that includes things like oil tankers, but that was equally true in Homer's time. Grain ships primarily would have been the most sensitive thing going through those straits. In ancient times you needed favorable winds to get through the straits, and in case there were unfavorable winds you'd probably have to hold up at the harbor where Troy was located. Today the Trojan Bay is completely silted up. This map will show you what it used to look like at about the time of the siege of Troy, and the dotted white line is the present coastline. We are on Hisarlik now, which is the mound that Troy was built on. In the distance there, that low-lying flat field, that's where the bay was. One of the things that Homer says about Troy is that the wind blew strongly there, and that's still true today. Now, if you ask the average person who discovered Troy, they're likely to say Heinrich Schliemann. This is not strictly correct, however. When Heinrich Schliemann got to the area of Troy in search of the city, he didn't have the foggiest idea where it was, so he started asking around. And he ran into a Frank Calvert, who was the U.S. consul. And Frank Calvert actually put him on to Hisarlik as the site. Incidentally, this wall that we're looking at right now could very well date from the time of the Trojan War. It's possible that Patroclus or even Achilles tried to climb this wall. Anyway, back to Schliemann. So why isn't Frank Calvert generally considered to be the discoverer of Troy? Well, one thing to keep in mind is that Frank Calvert didn't have many resources and he wasn't able to do very much. On the other hand, Heinrich Schliemann was rich. He had made his money in the gold rush out in California. The result was that Frank Calvert couldn't afford to hire folks to help him, but Schliemann could hire gangs of people to clear away dirt and to move things about. Now, to the average person, the sort of thing that you see here, for the most part, looks like it's just a jumble of rocks. And that certainly must be the way that Schliemann originally thought of it. His going-in position was that the city of Achilles and Hector and Priam, that would be the lowest city, the one furthest down. He expected cities to have been built on top of it, but the city at the base he expected to be the city of the Iliad. So Schliemann started right away to dig a big ditch all the way through the mountain in order to get to the lowest possible level. In doing so, he obliterated all the evidence of the layers in between. Schliemann discovered a complex site of 9 different levels, some of which were more recent than Troy, but many of which were far earlier. By cutting the trench the way he did, Schliemann may very well have made it impossible to absolutely prove that this is the site of Troy. It now turns out that the site goes back to probably about 3000 BC, and Troy 1 through Troy 5 levels basically bring it up to about 1700 BC. Now at that point, there's a new culture that takes hold at Troy 6, and this population is Indo-European, related to the Mycenaeans, and it may very well be the city of the Iliad. Troy 6 begins about 1700 BC and continues to about 1250 BC, roughly the date of the siege of Troy. Heinrich Schliemann was an amateur archaeologist, but he was fortunately followed by 2 professional archaeologists, Carl Blagen and
So we walk around this to see this part of the fortification wall. After a fire that badly damaged what they found out. So let's walk around this and then see it, how it was done.
Now, many tourists have been visiting Troy over the years. Some of them you may even recognize their names. On his way into Greece, Xerxes stopped by here, vowing that his invasion of Greece was in part vengeance for what happened at Troy. He sacrificed 1,000 oxen here and probably put on quite a barbecue for the army. Alexander the Great paid a visit to Troy going the opposite direction, destroying the Persian Empire, and he is said to have left his armor there in exchange for Achilles' armor, which he was supposed to have worn in battles. Julius Caesar dropped by on his cultural tour of this area as a child. The Fourth Crusade Crusaders also claimed that their activities were in part a result of vengeance for Troy, and Mechmed II said the same thing. Everyone from Xerxes to Mechmed II seems to have visited this particular location and known that this location was in fact the site of Homer's Iliad, the Troy. They say that Heinrich Schliemann discovered Troy. Actually, that's not true. Troy was never lost. Alexander was here. Julius Caesar was here. It was not really lost. It was just misplaced. Schliemann did claim to make one fantastic discovery at Troy, though. Very close to where the ramp is that you're just about ready to see, he dug up what he called Priam's treasure. This turned out to be one of the most fantastic gold treasures ever found by any archaeologist anywhere at any time. Schliemann quickly spirited the gold out of Turkey, and on its way towards Berlin, he had his wife Sophie dress up in it and had a photo op. The material made it into Berlin, and then at the end of World War II, this material disappeared, and its existence was not certain for a very long time. What we now know is that in the closing days of World War II, the Russians grabbed these artifacts, in part because the Nazis had been stealing treasure from Soviet museums. But the point is that they grabbed it, they brought it back to Moscow, and they didn't disclose to the world what happened to it. We now know that it's been in the Pushkin Museum all this time. The result is that Turkey and its museums have only a remnant of the precious metal that was said to have been located in Troy. And I say said to have been located in Troy for a good reason. Heinrich Schliemann was a known liar. The fact of the matter is, he said that Sophie was there helping him with the discovery, and we know for a fact that Sophie wasn't even in the country at the time. The result is, it's entirely possible that Schliemann had bought this material and had planted it himself and made up the whole story. Here's something I just had to show you. Homer's Iliad makes reference to a boar's tusk helmet, and for a very long time none had been found, but a few decades ago someone discovered an actual boar's tusk helmet, and this is what it looks like. So what did Troy look like? Well, I've got a number of possible depictions of Troy and generally what it looked like. This is a standard Hittite gate, city wall and towers, and the Trojans probably used something very similar to that. Now the problem, or one of the problems that Schliemann had, and Carl Blagan and Dorpfeld for as far as that goes, is that Troy is extremely small. It's only recently that the current excavation team, the Tübingen and Cincinnati team, has come up with a lower city to add to the size of Troy to make it a formidable site. What you're looking at is only the citadel that Schliemann found. It's that little yellow space on this particular chart. However, the Tübingen and Cincinnati team found a much larger lower city. It's encircled in red.
A defensive perimeter well outside the city walls. This would make Homer's Troy several times larger than previously thought. Suddenly, Troy wasn't so small. Suddenly, Troy was looking much more defensible.
In order to attack the city, you would have had to have disembarked from your chariot, gone into and out of the ditch, all the while dodging arrows that were being shot at you by Trojans who were behind a wall not far in the distance. You then had to scale that wall, run through the lower city, that's 1,200 feet. Then you would have reached...
Another thing that has always bedeviled archaeologists is that there's very little sign of warfare at Troy. Yes, certainly there is destruction and there is fire, but there's very little indication of actual warfare.
Arrowheads, used by ancient warriors in this very city. Finally, a connection to a military destruction of Homer's Troy. Schliemann proved there was a Troy. Carl Blagan showed it was besieged, burned, and destroyed. The Tübingen Cincinnati team found that Troy was a large city subject to a military attack. But can we say that the Trojan War, the subject of Homer's life's work, and Schliemann's obsession, really took place?
So I think there was a Trojan War. We have circumstantial evidence that the Mycenaeans are fighting in northwest Anatolia as early as the 15th century, perhaps 300 years before the so-called Trojan War.
There were wars between the Greeks and the Trojans. It certainly wouldn't be surprising because Troy is located in this border region where the Greeks and the Hittites continually sought control. And so Troy was an attractive target for both sides. Certainly there were wars. We have the archaeological evidence for it.
Wait a second. The only evidence that he has is a couple of bronze arrowheads. Now, they tried to explain that away by saying that bronze was very valuable, and after the battle, people would go around and police up the arrowheads so that they could be reused. Okay, that makes sense. But that doesn't prove that there was a battle here. The only thing that we really have is charred ruins. We know that there was a fire. We know that there was earthquake-like destruction. Now, we really have to look for other evidence, for other literature, for other sources to prove that this war actually took place.
The late Bronze Age, the 13th century BC, was a time of great empires in the Near East. Babylon, ancient but now declining, Assyria, a rising militarist power in what is now Iraq, Egypt, ruled for most of the century by the great builder Ramses II. And lastly, the Hittites, in what is now Turkey, ruling from the Egyptian frontier all the way to the Aegean Sea. And it is the Hittites who are the key to this stage of our search.
We're going to the little city of Boghazköy, now called Boghazkali. It's not very far from Ankara, and it used to be the location where the old Hittite capital was. The old Hittite capital name was Hatusha. If there was a major military confrontation anywhere in the Anatolian Peninsula, surely the people at Hatusha were aware of it. It's the Hittites that must provide the alternate source. The Hittite records are going to refer us to a place called Wilusa, which is going to be Troy, and a king there by the name of Alexandros, or Alexander, which is the alternate name for Paris, in the Iliad. There was a time when people thought the Hittites might be a myth. It wasn't until 1834, when there was a French traveler by the name of Charles Texier, who stumbled on the ruins of the Hittite capital at Hatusha, and near Boghazköy, now called Boghazkali. And then it wasn't until 1905 excavations started, and they started digging up some really important works of art. Most of them are now in the Ankara Museum. And the Hittite state archives were also located, written on cuneiform and thousands of clay tablets. And over a period of time, those were deciphered, and we've got a fair history now of the Hittite Empire. They were an Indo-European language-speaking group. They swept into Anatolia about 2000 BC. They conquered the local folks, who are confusingly called the Hatti, and they borrowed their culture and their name. And they established themselves at Hatusha, the capital, and over the course of about a millennium they built the city up. And it was around 1200 BC that it was at its height and began to decline. In the 14th century BC, the Hittite Empire finally made superpower status, and its leader was referred to as a great king. What made the Hittites so important may very well have been the discovery of the ironworking process. The Hittites seem to have been either the first or nearly one of the first to discover how to work iron. The result is that their weaponry improved substantially. But that's not the only thing I found interesting. Here in this next shot you're going to see a saw. And this saw looks like any other that you might happen to have in your tool chest. It's got teeth at the bottom of a blade. I found this remarkable, and it's the only example of it that I've ever seen. I found it in the Boghazköy Museum. Here, there's an example of Hittite stonework. Now, notice that it appears that the stone has been laid, and then the stone laid above it has been worked so that the two fit together. That's exactly the same process that the Inca used, and it is very earthquake reliable. Another thing that the Hittites did, and I'm always impressed by this, is they had a great capability to handle water. Underneath their streets, for example, you frequently find plumbing of the sort and design and quality that even the Romans would have respected. I also noticed in the city of Hatusha, the temple complex in particular, that they had some gutters which they had been using apparently to fend off diffuse rainwater, I think. But what I was most impressed by at Hatusha was a reconstruction of a section of the Hittite city wall and a couple of towers. This is the sort of technology that would have been in use in the Middle East all throughout most biblical times. This is a mud wall. It's reinforced with wood, and you can see that it's got a stone base on it. This reconstruction is at the location where the Hatusha city wall actually was. So it'll give you a good perspective as we go back through the city. You can see how far the other side of town would have been from wherever we're taking our photographs or videotape. This is the large temple complex just inside the city wall. Now, Hittite religion seems to have been adopted from the Hatti, and the weather god Teshub and a sun goddess Hebat were the two most important deities. There was somewhere around 1,000 lesser gods that played various other roles, and they seem to have gotten into the Hittite religion by incorporating the gods of other conquered peoples. That green cubic rock down there, that was a gift from Ramses II after the signing of the Kadesh Peace Treaty. Apparently it had some important significance to both cultures. Apparently there's only two like this in the world. Now here you can see how close the temple complex is to the Hittite city wall and how big the temple complex is, and you can see how close they both are to the city of Bogatskali. Thousands of cuneiform tablets were found in the temple area there. The city wall is something over 4 miles long, and on site it seemed like it was longer than that. We're next going to the Lion Gate. The Lion Gate has two stone lions, one on either side of the gateway, to protect the city from evil spirits or such. It's one of at least 6 gateways that we can see in the city's defensive walls. These walls are at least 4,000 years old. The walls enclose an area of something over 300 acres. Hatusha didn't start out as the capital for the Hittites. Actually, this started out as a market for some Assyrian merchants, but the market became more important over a period of time. The Hittites say that one of their original capitals was a place called Kusara. Now, Kusara has never been located, so if you want to make your name in archaeology, you could go start taking a look for it. In the next scene, I'm going to be showing you a 70-meter long tunnel. They used a corbelled arch because they didn't have the true arch technology. But why would there be a 70-meter long tunnel going underneath the wall? Well, a lot of people have been theorizing about that, and one theory is that its purpose was to allow the defenders of the city to make surprise attacks on besieging enemies. However, it's fairly obvious that there's a tunnel there, and it's visible from the outside. And there's two sets of monumental steps leading up to the embankment on either side of the tunnel, and that casts some doubt on the secret nature of that tunnel. So it's not entirely clear why the tunnel is there at all. One possibility is that the tunnel is there for some kind of ceremonial purpose, but nobody really knows exactly what that purpose might have been. Now, as I said, this tunnel uses a corbelled arch, and that means that the tunnel was built using a series of flat stones, each one leaning towards the other, creating a kind of a triangular profile. And that's the best technology apparently that the Hittites had for this tunnel. In any event, whether it was for defensive purposes or whether it's a processional of some kind or some other purpose that we can't imagine now, you're able to walk where people walked about 3,000 years ago. The next place that we're going is to the Great Fortress. It's really a citadel inside the city, and it's the palace of the king. It's composed of 3 courtyards, each one higher than the last. And the last courtyard, of course, is right up against the wall. The citadel is protected on all sides by steep drops. On the outer side to the east, there's the natural drop, a cliff. But the inner side also had a man-made construction and a series of terraces supported by retaining walls made of vast limestone blocks. Today you have to climb up a flight of steps in order to get to it. But what's important about this site is not the fact that it was the citadel, but the fact that it was the archives for the Department of State. The archives were discovered in 1906, and they include about 2,500 pieces, including the Kadesh Peace Treaty between the Hittite monarch Hatusha III and the Egyptian pharaoh Ramses II. This is the royal palace at Hatusha. This is where the state archives were kept. And they were found here, in clay tablets about 100 years ago. A lot of the clay tablets tell us a great deal about what was going on. The Hittites had good relations with the Egyptians most of the time. And this happens to be a story about a messenger that came up from Egypt. And the messenger is from the Queen of Egypt. And the message is, "My husband is dead, and I have no son. People say that you have many sons, and that your sons are adult. If you send me one of your sons, he will become my husband, for it is repugnant to me to take one of my servants to my husband." Now, when the Hittite king learned this, he was a little bit concerned, and he gathered together his council, and he said, "Since the most ancient times, such a thing has never happened before." So he sent one of his people down to Egypt, and he told him, "Go bring me information worthy of belief. They may try to deceive me, and as to the possibility that they may have a prince, bring me back information worthy of belief." Well, a little while later, the messenger comes back from Egypt, and he says, the king says, "Perhaps they have a prince. They may be trying to deceive me and do not really want one of my sons to reign over them." But the Egyptian queen answered, and she said, "Why do you say they are trying to deceive me? If I had a son, should I write to a foreign country in a manner humiliating to me and my country? You do not believe me, and you even say so to me. Who was my husband is dead. I have no son. Should I then perhaps take one of my servants and make of him my husband? I have written to no other country. I have written only to you. They say that you have many sons. Give me one of your sons, and he will be my husband, and lord of the land of Egypt." So which Egyptian queen was this? Well, based on the time when the letters were written, it could very well be the wife of King Tut. King Tut died early, you recall. And the queen was very young. Now, King Tut was followed by the high priest, Ai. Ai was an old man, and the queen surely did not want to marry him. In fact, as soon as they were married, she disappears from history. No one knows what happened to her. Oh, and as far as the Hittite prince is concerned, he made it to the border of Egypt, and then he disappears too. By the way, the Hittite king was Shupililiumish. And when Shupililiumish wrote to people in Hittite land, he used characters kind of like what you see here. This is called Luan, and it's something that the Hittites borrowed. It was the basis for their own writing to their own provinces and to nearby vassals. But for purposes of writing to the Egyptians, one didn't use that system. You use cuneiform, which is the system that was invented by the Sumerians and the Akkadians. And it looks much more like this. It's a clay tablet which you use a stylus to incise various kind of wedge-shaped symbols on. We have thousands of these clay tablets from many different civilizations, including the Hittites and the Egyptians. But this next one right here, this one is extremely important. This is the Treaty of the Battle of Kadesh. Now, we always knew that there was such a treaty because Ramses had it inscribed on the Luxor temple walls in hieroglyphics. And so we knew what the text said, or at least what Ramses said the text said. Now we can also read the Hittite version, and the fact of the matter is the two texts are in fact identical. This is somewhat surprising because both parties, both Ramses and the Hittites, claim to have won the Battle of Kadesh, but winning appears to be in the eyes of the beholder. There are lots of good stories in the Hittite texts. One of the things that we find out is about the Battle of Kadesh. At the Battle of Kadesh, we find out that there was a certain person from the city of Ilios there. Now, Ilios is another name for Ilios, and Ilios is another name for Troy. And this person's name was Alexander. Alexander is another name for Paris. And this Alexander was in charge of a unit of chariotry on behalf of the Hittites at the Battle of Kadesh. Now, the Battle of Kadesh was too early for this Alexander to be the Paris of Homer's Iliad, but it may be his grandfather. Okay, we're going to have to straighten a few things out. The name of the city that we usually use for the city in the Iliad is Troy. However, Homer doesn't always refer to it as Troy. Sometimes he refers to it as Ilios, which seems to be an alternate for Troy. And in Latin, sometimes that comes out as Ilium, the difference simply being the Latin ending that's required. In English, the book is usually referred to as the Iliad, which refers to Ilios, the city, that is, Troy. And next is, in the Old Greek, the word that was used was Wilios instead of Ilios. There was a W sound at the beginning, and that W sound was dropped out of a lot of words. In Hittite, the Wilios becomes Wilusa. Apparently, the Hittite grammar seems to have required this kind of an ending. There's one other little discrepancy I'd like to point out. At the Battle of Kadesh, chariots are used as the main fighting platform. That is, the warriors closed with each other and fought from the chariots. But in the Iliad, that's not the case. There, the heroes are rushed to the front, dropped off by their chariots, and picked up later on by their chariots. Now, which was it really? Did they fight like they did in the Battle of Kadesh? Or was it like they say in the Iliad? Or has Homer forgotten how chariots were supposed to have been used? Next, we're going to Miletus. It's in the southwestern corner of Anatolia, and we're going there for a very particular reason. It's been there since Mycenaean times. In fact, it was the first of the Greek colonies on the mainland of Anatolia. Now, the reason why we're going there is because there was a meeting with the Hittite king at one point, and we're going to be talking about that. The name of the town at the time is Milawanda, or Milawata. Now, I said that the town was a Greek colony, but that's not strictly correct. Even Homer never refers to the Greeks or Hellenes. He calls the people the Achaeans, and he always refers to the Achaeans. The Hittites also don't refer to Greeks or Hellenes. They refer to Achaeawa, which we believe is the same as the Achaeans. Now, the reason for the meeting and the reason that we know about it is because of a letter called the Talakalawash letter. It's a letter from Hatusha III to the king of the Achaeawa around 1250 BC, probably just a little bit before the time of the fall of Troy. The Tawagalawash letter is named that because it refers to the brother of the king, who was named Tawagalawash, and we believe in Greek that that's Eteocles. Now we know that the Greeks had great kings. The Mycenaean word for great king is wanax, and it means king of kings, if you will. And by Homer's time, that word had gone into disuse, except when you're referring to gods. The common word for king in Homer's time, or for minor king in the Mycenaean times, is basileos. It's where you get the English word basilica, that is the home of a minor king. Agamemnon was a wanax, that is, a great king. But was there a king's brother called Eteocles? Well, it turns out that there was. About a generation before Agamemnon, Oedipus had 2 sons, and one of his sons was Eteocles. And for a while, Polynices, his brother, was king. But of course, Oedipus and Eteocles and Polynices were kings in Thebes, not Mycenae. But going back to the Tawagalawas letter, the bulk of the letter actually has to do with a freebooter by the name of Pirameridush. The Akyawa, in fact, may have been using Pirameridush to incite rebellion. He appears to have been a minor noble of some kind through the western provinces of the Hittite Empire. There had been several rebellions, and in those rebellions, usually Wilusa, Troy, stayed loyal to the Hittites. Pirameridush is in fact referred to at least 3 times, or at least in 3 different letters, by the Hittite king. 2 of those letters also refer to an attack on Wilusa. We're here in Miletus for a kind of special performance. At one time, Miletus was a very important Greek colony. In fact, it was the first Greek colony in this area. It was a Greek colony in Mycenaean times. The Achaeans, as they were called at the time, established this colony on a peninsula on Anatolia. It's very defensible. The Achaeans were sometimes friends and sometimes enemies of the Hittites. The Hittite king visited this place once upon a time. At that time it was called Milawanda, or Milawata. The reason that he visited here was because there was a troublemaker in the area called Pirameridush. And the reason that we know about him is because of a letter, a Hittite letter, that's called the Tawagalawas letter. Now, Tawagalawas is the way that the Hittites said Eteocles. Eteocles isn't a major character in the letter, but the letter was named after him. Eteocles was the brother of the great king. Now, the Hittite king came here because of Pirameridush. He had been causing a lot of trouble in the area. And on his way here, the Hittite king was attacked by Pirameridush's people. And as a result of the attack, the Hittite king captured 7,000. And those 7,000 were held captive. And then when the Hittite king was occupied elsewhere, Pirameridush's people came and recaptured those people and brought them back here to Milawanda, or Miletus. That's what sets up this meeting. The king of the Hittites comes here to talk to the Achaean governor, and he's going to deliver a message that cannot be mistaken.
What happened next we have in Hattusha's own words, and after a week on the road in his company, it was easy to put yourself in his shoes.
I entered your city, Milawanda, because I have a few things to say to Pia Maradush that I think it would be good the rest of your citizens here listen to. But my visit here has not gone very well. I asked to see your brother, Tawa Kalawash, and I'm told he's away. I asked to see Pia Maradush, and I'm told he's taken a ship and gone overseas. Meanwhile, while all this is going on, I receive a letter from you, a letter that can only be described as insolent, adopting a tone barely tolerable between equals, forbidding me to remove Pia Maradush from Milawanda. You write to me, my brother, as a great king, as my equal. But in your letter, I do not hear the language of an equal. I'm directed...
Yes, if I can just say something here, this is very interesting. Hatusha, throughout his life, was very touchy about the way that he came to the throne because he'd deposed his nephew, and anybody who suggested that he wasn't a genuine great king made him see red. In fact, Ramses II of Egypt had to write to him saying, look, my brother, of course you're a great king. You've done wonderful things in Hittite land, and don't worry about it.
Are you aware, or is it even with your blessing, that Pia Maradush is going around boasting that he intends to leave his wife, children, and incidentally my 7,000 prisoners under your protection while he continues his piratical raids against my territory? Look, we're friends, you and I. There's been no disagreement between us since the affair over Wilusa, when I'm sure I was able to persuade you that it was no cause for war between us. As for my armed occupation of your town, Milawanda, look upon it as a friendly visit. I'm sorry if I appeared impolite or aggressive. It's true I was a little hot-headed in the past. From now on, let's live together in perfect friendship. Thank you.
Tremendous, isn't it? Can you imagine any modern government being so reasonable?
And there is yet another treaty that's important to Wilusa. There was an Alexander who was king of Wilusa who signed a treaty with the Hittite king Muwatallish. Now, this treaty implies that Alexander had previously gotten a treaty with Muwatallish's father, Murshili. In any case, Alexander is also known to have been the successor of another Wilusa king called Kukuni, although it doesn't appear that he was an immediate successor. In the letter, Muwatallish recalls the friendship of Kukuni with his own grandfather, Shupililiumish, and he further invokes 3 centuries of friendship between the Hittites and Wilusa, dating back to the reign of Hatusha I. Now here's a twist for you. Pira Maradush may have reigned as king of Wilusa before Alexander and after Kukuni. And it could very well be that Pira Maradush offended the Hittites in some way and they expelled him and made him a rebel king. Of course, the Miletus that I took you to was a classic Miletus. That mound out in the distance, that's actually the Mycenaean Miletus, but the classic city made a much better backdrop for my story. And how about this for a twist? Pira Maradush sounds a little bit like Priam. All of this is very controversial and, frankly, confusing. It's difficult to keep track of who's who. But what about this horse? The horse doesn't come up in the Iliad, but it's part of the story. So what about this horse story? Where does it come from? The Iliad ends with the death of Achilles, and the Trojan horse is long after that. Well, there are other sources on the Trojan War. This one was written in Hellenistic times, and it takes place basically after Achilles has died, after the Iliad is wound up. The Iliad covers only a very small segment of the Trojan War. The Trojan War is supposed to have gone on for 10 years, and yet the Iliad only covers the last year. And indeed, for all practical purposes, it really only covers about 1 week of that year. Basically, what happens is Hector kills Patroclus, Achilles' cousin. That brings Achilles back into the fight. Achilles comes up and kills Hector, the hero of Troy, and Hector's brother Paris shoots Achilles with an arrow in the Achilles tendon, and that kills Achilles, and that leaves Paris, who's also killed. So the Achaeans end the battle for the city of Troy, the same place where they started it at the beginning of the Iliad, outside the walls, and they're no further along. It's the cunning Odysseus who makes up the plan to build a great wooden horse that's hollow on the inside, and that they fill that with Achaean heroes, and that the Trojans would bring it inside the city, and that the heroes would pop out and open the gates for the Achaean army, which had reappeared on the coast. Now, the truth is that even in ancient times, nobody believed that one. The ancients immediately began speculating about what the real cause for the fall of Troy was, and they came up with several alternate, satisfactory explanations for the horse.
Could one of the greatest military deceptions ever have been a historical fact?
All historical Greeks knew about the story of the Trojan horse. The minute they began to experiment with the representation of figures of the human form.
A besieging army would sometimes construct a siege engine, literally a rolling battering ram with soldiers inside. This Assyrian depiction from the 7th century BC, around Homer's time, shows a horse-like siege engine breaking the walls of a fortified city. Perhaps the Trojan horse was just such a device.
Pausanias said, "Anyone who doesn't think the Trojans were utterly stupid will have realized that the horse was really an engineer's device for breaking down the walls." Now, the fact is, the story does stress that the wall was broken down when the horse entered the city. It's possible that this is a garbled recollection of some kind of siege machine. Now, they certainly existed in the Near East. The basic problem with this hypothesis, though, is that in 13th century Aegean, there is absolutely no evidence of siege machines or the technology to create them, or any experience with siege machines. There is one other possible explanation. Earthquakes are quite common in this part of the world, and an earthquake in this area might possibly have damaged the walls. A break in the walls caused by an earthquake may be just the thing that the Greeks needed. The Achaeans may very well have associated with that earthquake with Poseidon, and Poseidon is associated with the horse.
And the animal associated with Poseidon is the horse. So if you say Earthquake equals Poseidon. Poseidon equals horse. Ergo, earthquake equals Trojan horse. You've got it. The Trojan horse could simply be a metaphor for the earthquake.
But in Homer, the horse is real, and the trick works.
At about midnight, once the Trojans have had, shall we say, a bit too much to drink, and they've all gone to sleep, the Mycenaeans inside the horse open up the trap door, climb on down, kill the guards at the gate.
We're at Çatalhöyük, and this is reportedly one of the earliest agricultural communities on the face of the planet. 9,000 years old. This may be the oldest. It's possible that Jericho is older or that some other is older, but this one is likely to be the oldest. Let's take a look around. The first thing you see is a reconstructed house. This reconstructed house is done according to the pattern that you find at Çatalhöyük. The difference here is that this house has a door. It happens that the original natives came in through the roof, and that's what that ladder is there for. Otherwise, the house is pretty much unremarkable. It's got the usual sleeping quarters that you would expect, some storage, and cooking facilities. This is what the actual dig site at Çatalhöyük looks like. The dig site is now under cover and somewhat better protected than it was before. Before, the dig site had been left open to the elements without a cover on it at all, and there was substantial concern that it was going to deteriorate away. Next we have some artifacts that are in the Ankara Museum. These are basically grave goods, and what's coming up is a salt shaker. And next is a statue of the goddess Sybil, one of the oldest we have. This is a more relatively recent Hittite tomb. It's a reconstruction, of course, but it has some interesting artifacts here. Oh, and incidentally, those are cow skulls. The reconstruction is in the Chora Museum. Look at those big metal circles that are on the ground. Nobody really knows what those things are. The archaeologists call them sun disks. It's assumed that they have some kind of ritual purpose. Our next topic is going to be Cappadocia. Cappadocia is one of those places where good fences were not quite enough to make good neighbors. The village raiding basically forced some of the villagers to start living underground, or at least underground for temporary purposes. Now, nobody knows just how many underground sites there are in Cappadocia. The number has been estimated at around 300. Some say that there's one for every village and settlement in the region, but certainly not all the sites can be described as cities. The locals went underground here for a couple of different reasons. One is the landscape of Cappadocia is formed from tufa rock, which is easy to work. It's a volcanic rock, and the deeper you go, the easier it is to work. But then, after you've worked it, the surface dries to a very hard stone. And that's enough for you to excavate wide rooms with horizontal ceilings. In addition, trees producing wood suitable for building is quite scarce in Cappadocia, and apparently it always has been. So even the surface dwellings tend to be barrel vaulted using the tufa.
This one is air ventilation shaft. When you get your head in it, you can feel it, fresh air coming in. You know, there is no problem with air, with oxygen. I hope you can look one by one, and I hope you can give the message each other, you know, to look the shaft.
These tunnels may have started out as storage pits and wells and the like, but over a period of time they got deeper and deeper and more complex. In some places they're many levels deep with many large rooms, some of them specialized to be used as kitchens or churches even, wine presses and so forth. The tunnel entrances were hidden, and there were circular stones that could be rolled in front of the entrances to stop any aggressor coming in, and there'd be a hole in the center of the circular stone so that someone with a bow and arrow could shoot out and defend the position. These tunnels probably go back to Hittite times or even earlier, but the first mention we have of the subterranean sites occurs in Xenophon, written around 400 BC. Xenophon was a Greek mercenary who took charge of the 10,000 Greek mercenaries after the death of Cyrus. They had been marching across Cappadocia. And he says the houses were built underground. The entrances were like wells, but they broadened out lower down. There were tunnels dug in the ground for the animals, while the men went down by ladder. Inside, the houses were goats, sheep, cows, and poultry with their young. There was also wheat, beans, and barley wine in great bowls. When one was thirsty, one was meant to take a reed and suck the wine into one's mouth. This barley wine is exceedingly strong and best mixed with water, but any man who is accustomed to it and drinks it undiluted enjoys its flavor to the full. We've been visiting Kaimakli, which alone could probably hold tens of thousands of people if it had to, but it's not the largest of the underground cities. That goes to Derinkuyu, or the Deep Well. This underground city goes down for 8 levels, which are open to the public. There are at least 12 levels or more that have not yet been excavated. It's said that there are 600 outside doors to this city. They're hidden in various courtyards from the surface buildings and things like that. And there is speculation that the two cities that we've been in, which are 9 kilometers apart, are linked. The area open to tourists now goes down about 160 feet. What you can see is rock-cut tables, living quarters, churches, armories, tunnels. You can see stables, wine presses, and a dining hall and school. and there's all sorts of other things. A crucifix-shaped church, a meeting hall with 3 supporting columns, a dungeon, and on the lower level there's actually a temporary grave. Coming up is the temporary grave that I promised you. In this particular case, a tourist has been kind enough to act the part of the corpse so that you can see just exactly how big it is and how well somebody would fit into it. From the underground cities now we're going to the opposite extreme, and we're going to be hitting one of the main highlights of Cappadocia, one of the really great things to do. In this case, we're going on a hot air balloon ride. And of course, those always start at dawn. One of the interesting things about this is that we're not alone on our hot air balloon ride in Cappadocia. It seems like everybody in the neighborhood is doing the same thing. We're now headed to the old city of Gordium. You may have heard of the town before, and I'm going to tell you some familiar stories. But there is also a reference to Gordium in the Old Testament, Ezekiel, but there the place is named Meshech. In this valley there are over 100 royal tumuli. These are from the Phrygian period, right after the Hittites. At a time of civil trouble in this area, there was an oracle that foretold that a poor man would enter Gordium by ox cart one day, and he would rule over the Phrygians. As the king and nobles were discussing this prediction, a farmer named Midas arrived in the city with his cart. Gordius, who had no heirs, saw this as a fulfillment of the prophecy and named Midas his successor. Subsequently, Midas had his cart placed in the temple of Cybele on the Gordian Acropolis, where it stood for half a millennium. Somehow the belief arose that whoever untied the knot that fixed the cart to its yoke would become master of Asia. During his stay in the city, Alexander the Great took it upon himself to undo the Gordian knot. He failed to untie it, but he severed it with his sword. Over a period of time, the name of the king of this area alternated between Gordius and Midas. Midas's son would be Gordius, and Gordius's son would be Midas. So the tomb we're about to enter is either that of Midas or Gordius. You've got a 50-50 chance one way or the other. The other good story that comes from this area is Midas and the Golden Touch. And according to the story, Midas captured a water demon by the name of Silenus after making him drunk by pouring wine into his spring. In ransom for Silenus, Midas demanded of Dionysus the ability to turn all he touched into gold. Dionysus granted his wish, but Midas was dismayed when he found out that he had been taken quite literally, and his food and even his own daughter were transformed into gold. He begged Dionysus for release from the curse and was ordered to wash his hands in the river Pactolus. The cure worked, and thereafter the river ran with gold. This tumulus dates from between 7 and 800 BC. And the mound here is about 60 meters, that's about 180 feet high, and it's 300 meters or about 900 feet in diameter. At the end of this passageway, there's a wooden house that is actually the tomb. It's kind of a cottage. It's made out of cedar and juniper logs. This is the oldest wooden structure in Anatolia, perhaps the oldest one in the world. The structure is behind an iron cage, and I couldn't get them to open it for me. As a matter of fact, the guard said that the U.S. consul had been there just a few weeks before, and he had asked the same question, and he wasn't allowed beyond the cage either. So I'm going to do the best that I can to shoot through the bars and let you see as much of the structure as you can. Actually, fairly small amounts are visible. Then after that, I'm going to show you some artifacts. First of all, some miniatures of what the log structure looks like. And then we're going to start moving into some furniture. Yes, there was furniture, wooden furniture in here. The wooden furniture is now in the Ankara Museum, and I'm also going to show you a diagram of what it's said to have looked like. One thing that you've probably noticed is that the whole thing is substantially reinforced by metal rods and wires. Here's the reconstruction and the original furniture from the tumulus, which is now in Ankara. This particular piece happens to be a table, and it's really extremely complex. Midas's golden touch wasn't really entirely a fable. They actually did do gold mining in this area, but the way they did it was kind of interesting. One of the ways that they did it, apparently, was by putting a sheepskin down in the river streams. The heavy particles of gold will, of course, get entangled in the sheep's pelt. And that may very well be the basis for the story of the Golden Fleece. Next, we're headed to Sardis, the old regional Persian capital. We're at the city of Sardis. Sardis was the capital of Lydia, and in Persian times it was sort of a regional capital. Sardis, among other things, was the end of the royal road, the road from Susa to Sardis. The Persian version of the Pony Express ran between here and Susa, and it ran in record time. It only took about a week to make the trip. Herodotus says of those riders that neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds. That sound familiar? Back in the days when this was the capital of Lydia, it was a very wealthy place. You've probably heard the term rich as Croesus. Well, Croesus was a king of Lydia, and his capital was in this place. Coinage, for example, was invented here. Well, inevitably, of course, Croesus had attracted too much attention, and Cyrus the Great sent his army out after him and defeated Croesus. Croesus and the remnant of his army climbed up to that mountain in the background, and they had fortifications up there. That was their Acropolis, and they made their last stand at that point. Now, Cyrus wanted to root them out, of course, and he offered a reward to the soldier that could figure out how to do it. One of Cyrus's soldiers saw a helmet drop from the Acropolis, and for one of the Lydian soldiers to go down and pick it up. And therefore he surmised that was the easiest way to attack the city, and that is the way that Cyrus went and took the Acropolis, and that was the end of Lydia. Our next topic is the classic city of Ephesus.
"100 miles up the Persian coast from Halicarnassus stood the largest marble temple ever constructed. It had been built at Ephesus, the wealthiest city in Asia Minor and the largest port on the Aegean. The temple, dedicated to the goddess Artemis, attracted pilgrims who flocked here to visit her cult shrine. Artemis was a mother goddess, her many breasts symbolizing the fertility of women. King Croesus, renowned for his wealth, financed the building of a temple to her in 550 BC construction. The temple became a massive tourist attraction. Then, on the night of Alexander the Great's birth, tragedy struck. Legend records that the goddess Artemis left the great temple to be with him. While she was away, a pyromaniac, wanting his name to be remembered forever, burned the temple to the ground. The temple had a wooden roof and staircase. Once a falling beam had toppled a column, collapse was inevitable. Although the pyromaniac's name was erased from all records for his appalling crime, the word Herostraton has remained to describe infamy. But the Temple of Artemis had a second life. Within decades, it was rebuilt, becoming one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world.
Today, few people visit the site. There's just simply not much to see, but in the old days, the temple measured 160 feet by nearly 500 feet and had 127 ionic columns. Today, you can see one column standing, and there's usually a stork on top of that. In addition, the whole ground is very boggy and prone to flooding. This is a home more for turtles and frogs than it is for people or anything else anymore. In fact, I saw more turtles here at the temple of Diana. Well, it's either Diana or Artemis or even Sybil. It just depends on which background you're using. I found more turtles here than I've seen in years anywhere. One thing more about Diana. It's often said that she has a large number of breasts on her statue, and that may very well be what those lumps are. But no one is really sure of that, and there are other interpretations. They may even be bull's testicles. Like every other Greek city, this city was founded according to the advice of an oracle. There was a certain Androclus, who was the son of King Codrus of Athens. He consulted an oracle about where to found the city. The oracle answered, "Choose the site indicated by the fish and the boar." Androclus sat down with some fishermen near the mouth of the local river, and this is near where the great theater is. We'll be visiting that later. And as they grilled some fish for lunch, one of the fish leapt out of the brazier, taking with it a hot coal, which ignited some shavings, which in turn set some brush afire. A wild boar had been hiding in the brush, and he ran in alarm from the fire, and the spot at which the fishermen killed it became the site of the Ephesus Temple of Artemis. Most of the city of Ephesus that has been excavated has been the part of the city that was the public part of the city, the forums, the theater, and so forth. But this particular footage comes from what are called the terrace houses or the slope houses. These are fairly recently excavated, and this was the high rent district in Ephesus. Some of these houses are 40,000 square feet or so. The single building which is most famous from Ephesus, though, must be the library. This building was in fact built as a library, the one that you're about to see, and it was the third largest library in ancient times. This library was designed specifically as a library, and it has been built with specific wall construction that would stabilize the temperature inside in order to preserve the scrolls. But the most famous story must surely be about St. Paul. He was here approximately in the years 51 to 53 AD. St. Paul had been preaching in Ephesus and the neighborhood, for as far as that goes, and a certain Demetrius, who was a silversmith, he made the little shrines of Artemis, and he and his friends depended on that trade to a very high extent. They got all upset with Paul's preaching. Demetrius and his friends were in the theater, and they virtually had a little riot going on, shouting, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." The shouting kept up for a couple of hours. The rioters were eventually calmed down by the city clerk and encouraged to use the courts instead of demonstrating against Paul. This is where the crowd shouted at St. Paul, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians." This was the city of Pergamum, back in Roman times at least. The Acropolis, which is way back on the hill that you're about ready to see, is where we're going to be going, because that's where the old ruins are located. That hill was the location of the main public buildings, like the theater or library and so forth. The Pergamum of Eumenes II is remembered most of all for its library. It's said to have had more than 200,000 volumes. The library was a symbol of Pergamum's social and cultural climb. Eumenes was a passionate book collector, and his library came to challenge the world's greatest, which was in Alexandria. The Library of Alexandria was said to have 700,000 books. Now, Alexandria was afraid that the Pergamum library would attract famous scholars away from Alexandria, and the Egyptians, in order to stop that, cut off the supply of papyrus from the Nile. And of course, papyrus was how most scrolls were made back in those days. But never one to balk at a challenge, Eumenes set his scientists to work, and lo and behold, they came up with pergamon, in the Latin parchment, a writing surface made from animal hides rather than pressing papyrus reeds. In the end, however, it was the Egyptians who got the last laugh. When the library at Alexandria was damaged by fire, Mark Antony pillaged the one at Pergamum for books to give to his beloved Cleopatra. Incidentally, this hill wasn't always flat and smooth like this to support the buildings. You would think that maybe the way that they would make it flat and smooth would be by leveling the mountain a little bit. But in fact, that's not what they did. Instead of just leveling the mountain, and I assume a certain amount of that was done, what they did was they built up the sides of the mountain, and this is the underneath of what you just saw. This is the support system that's holding up that platform that had the temples on it. Now, the other thing that is truly impressive is the theater. It's a 10,000 seat theater, and that's not unduly large. But what's important about this is one of the steepest theaters in the world. This thing was constructed in the 3rd century during the reign of Caracalla, but it's the steepness that you're going to be impressed by, or at least that I was impressed by. While I was out filming the theater, something that I had planned to do, I heard some goat bells in the distance. I could tell that they were down in a temple not very far from the base of the theater. Some time ago, a historian from Denver suggested that he'd like to have some pictures of goats in ruins. I wasn't able to get him any at the time, but I thought that perhaps this would be my opportunity to do that. So I climbed down the steps, which was horrific all by itself, and I found the goat. But here we see the goat, and this goat is not only in the ruins, it has just given birth. That little red spot there is afterbirth, and the little brown lump is the goat's kid. And we're going to see the goat get up, and it's going to try to get the kid to move. And these are the baby's first steps. This is it, caught on film. Our next subject is Hierapolis, called now Pamukkale. Hierapolis was founded by King Eumenes II of Pergamum. The Romans loved it because it was a thermal spring, and Romans just loved hot water, and they came here as tourists by the thousands. There's a temple of Apollo here, and right next to it there's a cave. The cave was called the Plutonian. It was a place where poisonous gases emerged. According to Strabo, there was an ox that was thrust into this cave, and it kneeled over and it died. He himself experimented with doves. The temple measured about 60 feet by about 45, and it sat on a platform. Now, before the temple, there was a monumental fountain. The plutonium is interesting because it's one of those places where the local priest used to throw in small animals, and the small animals would immediately die. The priests, on the other hand, could walk in there and come out and be alive. The reason, of course, was because the poisonous gases were close to the surface of the earth. You know, plutonium is all sealed up and you can't get to it anymore, unfortunately. I guess that's to protect the tourists. In any event, the waters run out of there and they run down the side of the hill. And here you can see where the waters have left behind a very white coating of calcium. This has got to be one of the most spectacular sights in Turkey. Our next point is Istanbul, but before we get to Istanbul, or at least on the way to Istanbul, I've got a stop that I want to make. Istanbul, of course, is back up in the northwest corner of the country. Now here's something you might not expect. Hannibal Barca died just outside of what is today Istanbul. Yes, this is the Hannibal that invaded Italy, going over the Alps with elephants. He was eventually forced out of Carthage, and he fled to the east, where he was given refuge for a while, but Roman agents tracked him down, and he had to commit suicide just outside of what is now Istanbul. Turns out that this place was on the grounds of a cryptographic institute. I don't know how that happened, but I do know that when I tried to get back out the gate and they saw my camera, the security people went just a little bit crazy. Now, Istanbul is where it is because of its location in relationship to several bodies of water. It's at the Bosphorus choke point, so there's no difficulty in sealing off the flow of traffic from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. On the other side of the old city is the Sea of Marmara. And finally, on the third side is the Golden Horn. The result is the city only has to be defended on one landward side. Like all old Greek cities, this one has a founding legend. It was founded at about the same time that the city of Rome was in the 8th century BC, and legend has it that there was a Greek called Byzas from the city of Megara, which is not too far from Athens. He sailed off looking for a new city, and he, like everyone else, sought advice from the oracle at Delphi. The oracle advised him to found the city opposite the village of the blind. When Byzas and his fellow colonists sailed up the Bosphorus, they noticed the colony on the Asian shore, and they looked to the left and they saw the superb natural harbor of the Golden Horn on the European shore. Thinking those people must be blind, they settled on the opposite shore. And so the city took the name of its founder, Byzantion. In Latin, that becomes Byzantium. In the 4th century, Constantine moved the capital of Rome to this location, and he dubbed the new city New Rome. That didn't stick. It was called Constantinople very quickly, that is, the city of Constantine. The Turks called the city Istanbul. Istanbul, however, is not Turkish. It's really just a corruption of some Greek words that the Turks misunderstood. This means in the city. Officially, the name of the city was Constantinople all through the period of the Sultans. It wasn't changed officially to Istanbul until 1930. So now you know how the city got its name.
Constantinople, now it's Istanbul, now Constantinople, been a long time gone. Constantinople, now it's Turkish delight on a moonlit night. Every gal in Constantinople lives in Istanbul, now Constantinople. So if you've a date in Constantinople, she'll be waiting in Istanbul. Even old New York was once New Amsterdam. Why they changed it, I can't say. People just liked it better that way. So take me back to Constantinople. No, you can't go back to Constantinople. Been a long time gone. Constantinople, why did Constantinople get the works? That's nobody's business but the Turks. Istanbul, Istanbul. Istanbul, Istanbul. Even old New York was once New Amsterdam. Why they changed it, I can't say. People just liked it better that way. Istanbul is Constantinople, now it's Istanbul, now Constantinople. Been a long time gone, Constantinople. Why did Constantinople get the works? That's nobody's business but the Turks. Constantinople, been a long time gone. Constantinople, why did Constantinople get the works? That's nobody's business but the Turks. Istanbul.
If there's any one icon for Istanbul, it's got to be the Hagia Sophia, or sometimes it's called the Hagia Sophia or Saint Sophia. In any event, this particular structure was built in 532 to 537 during the reign of Emperor Justinian. Actually, it replaced an earlier Saint Sophia. The earlier Saint Sophia was destroyed by a riot, but I'll tell that story later. The central open space is over 100 feet wide. The dome itself rises to about something over 150 feet above the ground. The dome is supported by 40 massive ribs, and these are constructed of special hollow bricks made in roads from a unique light porous clay, and they're resting on huge pillars that are concealed inside the interior walls. But what really makes the Hagia Sophia is the mosaics. The mosaics were covered up during the period of time when it was a mosque, of course, but now many of them have been uncovered. My favorite is the mosaic of the Empress Zoe. She reigned from 1028 to 50, and she had 3 husbands, and so they had to change this mosaic portrait each time she picked up a new husband. The current portrait is the 3rd Mr. Zoe, Constantine the 9th. Constantine the 9th has survived only because Constantine the 9th outlived the Empress. The Blue Mosque is right across a park from the Hagia Sophia. The Blue Mosque is officially the mosque of Sultan Ahmet I. It was built at the beginning of the 17th century, and therefore it's over 1,000 years younger than the Hagia Sophia, although the two of them look very much alike. The Blue Mosque isn't blue on the outside, it's kind of a gray. It gets its name from the ceiling on the inside, which is inlaid with some distinctive blue tiles. This is a working mosque, so you're limited as to what you can do on the inside. Nevertheless, they do allow some photography, and this is the inside of the mosque. But you'll notice that there's something extremely different about this mosque from the Hagia Sophia. Notice that unlike the Hagia Sophia, which has a completely open space, this particular building has its dome supported by 4 massive columns. It's those 4 massive columns that show that this is technologically an inferior building. The Hagia Sophia and the Blue Mosque stand at the core of the old part of the city. And this is also near some other very interesting sites that I want to show you. The first one is the milestone. This is the stone by which all mileage is calculated from the city of New Rome or Constantinople. When New Rome was established, Constantine set up this pillar, now surrounded by scaffolding, and put a statue up on top of it to celebrate the reestablishment of the city. This next is very interesting. It's very close to the Hagia Sophia down in downtown Constantinople, and you can see fish swimming around, but it looks very, very dark. The fact of the matter is, this is the Roman Cistern. This is where the fresh water was kept for the city, and it's not the only cistern. There are at least 3 of them that I know of, and there were probably hundreds. Of course, it's underground. This one was built in 542 during the reign of Emperor Justinian. Now this cistern is a vast pillared hall with semicircular arches holding up the roof. There are more than 300 pillars here. Notice that even in this functional underground area, the tops of the pillars, the capitals, are decorated with elaborate carvings. These tend to be Corinthian capitals. This cistern has the capacity to hold something like 500,000 gallons of water. As bizarre as this place might be, it should seem somewhat vaguely familiar to you. You've probably seen it before. It was part of the movie From Russia with Love with James Bond.
Quite a place you've got here. The Emperor Constantine built it as a reservoir 1,600 years ago. Really? Here.
This next is the Bin Birdurek cistern. It's the second largest cistern in town, sometimes called the Cistern of 1,001 Columns. This cistern is believed to have been built under the house of a Roman senator that accompanied Constantine to the new city. The cistern is about 200 feet long by about 160 feet wide. The columns are about 40 feet tall. This cistern must surely be one of Istanbul's best kept secrets. It turns out that all of the muck has not yet been removed from this cistern. The floor is at the top of the muck, but if you were to dig below the floor and start removing stuff, those columns would be a lot taller. There's a little section of the floor where they have removed all of the sediment, and you can see the original floor of the cistern. Well, it's time for us to start going back up to the surface now and continue our tour of Istanbul. We're in the Hippodrome, where the chariot races were. Use your imagination. The Hippodrome factions started out in the ancient Roman trade guilds, which in Byzantine times developed into further associations. The blues were generally upper class, politically conservative, orthodox regarding religion, while the greens were from the lower classes, more radical in their political and religious views. You could think of them as Republicans and Democrats, if you like. In any event, the factions were the focus of a serious rivalry in Constantinople, centered on the circus events in the Hippodrome. But in 532, that rivalry was pretty much forgotten, and the members of the blue and green factions combined against Emperor Justinian in a protest against heavy taxation. And that resulted in riots, which resulted in the burning of the original Hagia Sophia church. And Justinian was about ready to run away when his wife, Theodora, stopped him. The Empress Theodora had been a courtesan, and she wasn't anxious to go back to her old life. Instead, she got Justinian to bring in his general Belisarius and the army, and the result was 30,000 greens and a few hundred blues were trapped in the Hippodrome and killed. It was a number of years before the greens recovered as a political and sporting faction. The center of the Hippodrome had three basic objects in it. One was the obelisk that had originally been erected in Egypt for Thutmose III. The Romans carried it to Constantinople to decorate the new city. The second one had been taken from Delphi, and this was a tripod that had a twisty stem to it. That twist was supposed to be three serpents that came up and supported the brazier. This second column had on it some bronze plates. Those bronze plates were removed by the Fourth Crusade crusaders that invaded the city around 1200. In fact, those crusaders did considerable amount of damage to Byzantium, and I believe it's a primary reason why it eventually fell to the Muslims in 1453. This model may help you to visualize the hippodrome. It was found in the Ben Berdik cistern that we were at earlier. This next is the only surviving aqueduct from the Roman period. It's the aqueduct of the Emperor Valens. Incidentally, it was raining that day, and so the aqueduct would have been carrying something that we had very little need of on that particular day at least. This aqueduct brought water in from the Belgrade forests. Incidentally, the Emperor Valens did not end well. It's unusual, but he was one of the few Roman emperors that was killed along with the majority of his army. In this particular case, he lost the Battle of Adrianople. He was defeated by the Goths. I'm going to be moving now out to the city walls. For the most part, the city walls were built by the Emperor Theodosius. He expanded the city that Constantine had left him. This is the anchor of the city walls of the Sea of Marmara. This is the strongest point in the walls. This particular point was never breached by anyone. This area is called the Golden Gate. It's called the Golden Gate because it was the strongest, but it's also the gate of the city that victorious Byzantine generals used to lead their armies through. It's sort of a triumphal entrance, a ceremonial entrance to the city, if you will. Being the strongest and best protected, it only had to have about a platoon of soldiers to hold it and one officer. The walls around the city were about 15 miles long and had 96 towers. When the Turks came to besiege the city in 1453, this area of the wall was not much in danger. At that time, there was about 15 miles of wall around Byzantium. The landward side was under attack by the Muslims. The Byzantines were holding the city with only about 7,000 troops. The Muslim forces had roughly 100,000. Now, the science fiction weapon of these days was the cannon, and the Ottomans decided that they were going to depend heavily on this particular new device, and so they employed a Hungarian or perhaps a German by the name of Urban, who was a specialist in the construction of cannons. Urban developed a cannon that could throw a ball that weighed 1,200 pounds. The thing was 27 feet long. On the downside for the Turks, though, the cannon could hardly hit anything. It was highly inaccurate, and it took 3 hours to reload. In addition, cannonballs that size were in short supply. There's a rumor that it collapsed from its own recoil after 6 weeks of operation. In the area where the motorway is now in front of the walls, there had been a large water moat. That large piece of artillery that I was talking about that Urban created, folks say that it took 90 oxen and 400 men to operate that cannon. And it never really worked very well. The fact of the matter is the Byzantines were able to repair almost all the damage that it did after every shot that it fired. But it wasn't the only cannon that the Turks had. Between the gate, which is now called the Topkapi Gate, which means Cannonball Gate, and Edirne-Kapi, which was the gate out to Adrianople, there was a slight depression, a little valley formed by the Lycus River. That river is filled in now, but that depression still exists, and that's where the artillery focused its fire, because it had a slight advantage. Even today, the city walls are in their weakest condition at this particular point. In addition, as the attack started, the Turks also tried to tunnel under the walls, and the Byzantines counter-tunneled under the command of an engineer named Johannes Grant, who is said to have been German, but was probably actually Scottish. Use your imagination now for a second to see the siege.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. It's the Sultan's army.
These appear to be some war surplus cannonballs. Notice that they're made out of stone. But neither the cannonballs, nor the tunneling, nor the massive numbers of troops was having much effect on the siege. The Turks were still outside, and the Byzantines still held the walls. While we're walking along the walls, I want to show you a church that's just inside the walls. It's a Chora Church, and it has some absolutely fantastic mosaics on the inside. In fact, I think they're better than the ones at Hagia Sophia. Like Hagia Sophia, the Chora Church is no longer a church. It's a museum. Both Hagia Sophia and the Chora Church are museums, in fact. Chora means in the country, and in the 1300s this place was in the country. It's near the Topkapi, the place where Constantine XI had his headquarters. At the end of the siege, when he realized that all was lost, he rode directly into the midst of the Turkish army near here, and his body was never identified. The interior of the church is absolutely covered with mosaics. Most of them show little vignettes from the Bible, stories about Christ or perhaps the apostles usually. Coming up is the woman that grabbed hold of the hem of Christ's garment as he was passing by. And then we're going to go over and we're going to see Lazarus being raised from the dead. Next we'll be seeing St. Paul, followed by St. Peter. Now remember, these mosaics are supposed to be in a church that is fairly dark but lit by candlelight. And the candlelight is what sets the mosaics off and makes them so pretty. They'll be shimmering and shining and changing color just a little bit along with the light source. Finally, we're going back outside again and back on the walls. And we're going to be continuing our walk north along the walls. And we're going to be reaching the part of the walls which was critical. This little bulge that you're about to see in the walls was identified by a number of conquerors, and there are only two people that really breached these walls, the Fourth Crusaders and the Turks. Both of them went through at this particular point. And here's the reason. These are not Roman-style construction walls. These walls are much more medieval and much weaker and much easier to get through. But it may not have been weak walls that caused the fall of Constantinople. Some historians suggest that the gate in this particular section of wall had been left unlocked, and the Ottomans discovered the mistake, and there's no suggestion yet of bribery or deceit or anything like that. It simply seems to have been overlooked. Anyway, the Ottomans rushed in, and that was the end of the defense of Constantinople. This is Topkapi Palace. It's back down near the Hagia Sophia, but don't confuse this with Topkapi, the gate in the wall. It's not the same at all. Topkapi is made up of a series of courtyards. We're in the first courtyard now, and that's the one that's available to everyone. This gate goes through to the second courtyard. To get through to the second courtyard, you have to be on some kind of official business. We'll be going to the third courtyard later. That's only open to the imperial family. And then there'll be a fourth courtyard that's open only to the family itself. This model of Topkapi starts at the gate to the second courtyard, and it'll probably give you a better idea of the size and complexity of the palace than anything I can do with the videotape. If you're on important imperial business, you'll probably be meeting with somebody in one of these next couple of hallways. The harem is the most popular point of visiting at Topkapi. Imperial princes were brought up in the palace harem. They were taught and cared for by its women and servants. In the early centuries, Ottoman princes were schooled in combat and statecraft by direct experience. They practiced soldiering. They fought in battles. They were given provinces to administer. But as the Ottoman dynasty did not observe the rule of primogeniture, the death of the Sultan regularly resulted in a fratricidal bloodbath, as his sons had to slog it out among themselves for the throne. In the case of Bayezid II, his sons began the battles even before his father's death. Now realizing that to lose meant certain death for themselves. The victorious son, Selim, forced Bayezid to abdicate and may even have had him murdered. Ahmet I couldn't bring himself to murder his mad brother Mustafa. Instead, he kept him imprisoned in the harem and thus began the tradition of the cage life. Later sultans followed the idea of house arrest, which meant that princes fell prey to the intrigues of women and eunuchs who ran the harem. Corrupted by the pleasures of the harem and ignorant of war and statecraft, they were usually unfit to rule when the occasion arose. Luckily for the empire, there were a number of grand viziers who were quite competent. Later, the Ottomans did adopt primogeniture, but by that time, it was too late. Let's see what's in here. Behind me is the treasury, but there's no photography allowed, so you'll have to use your imagination once more.
There is the Topkapi.
Topkapi? Topkapi? Where the Sultan's harems were?
Better. Topkapi, where the treasure room is. And in the treasure room, there is a glass case. And in the glass case, there is a sultan. And on the sultan, there is a dagger. And on the dagger, there are the four most beautiful emeralds on earth. The Topkapi emeralds. But they won't be there for much longer, I hope.
You're not thinking of,
I can't think of anything else.
Topkapi isn't.
The Topkapi emeralds are large, but they're dwarfed by the spoonmaker's diamond. It's an 86-carat rock, surrounded by several dozen smaller stones, and it gained its name after it was found in a rubbish dump and bought by a street peddler for 3 spoons. The peddler sold it to a jeweler, and then all hell broke loose when it was discovered to be a diamond, the world's 5th largest. Inevitably, the news leaked out, and the Sultan demanded it be given to him. This is the Egyptian spice market. It's the 2nd largest bazaar in old Istanbul. It's a covered bazaar like the largest bazaar, but its specialty traditionally has been spices. Now, they don't sell as many spices as they used to. It used to be you could go in here and buy just about anything on the face of the planet that could be vaguely described as spices, including gunpowder and all kinds of stuff. Nowadays, it's more oriented to the tourist, but not entirely so. They still do sell some spices. Our final subject now to wind up this video is Turkish Delight, which is sold here. They say the Turkish Delight in Istanbul is the best. Turkish Delight has been on sale here for a very long time. In fact, it's been on sale in Istanbul for about 230 years. A fellow by the name of Ali Muhyiddin came to Istanbul, and he established himself as a confectioner. And he was bored with the usual stuff, so he started playing around with a new confection. And lokum is what the local folks call it now. And it was an immediate hit with the Imperial Palace. And anything that went down well with the palace, of course, was going to be a hit in town. You've almost certainly heard of Turkish Delight before, if for no other reason than because it plays in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. This is the candy that the witch used to bribe Edmund.
Can you make me taller?
Anything you'd like to eat?
Turkish Delight?
Edmund, I would very much like to meet the rest of your family.